Well, today, of course, kicks off the beginning of the campaign, 16 Days of Activism Against Violence. Joining us for this conversation tonight, we're joined by Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Program Coordinator, Merita Ground, Teddy Bear Clinic Director, Dr. Shaheda Omar, and Department of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities, DG, Advocate Mikateko Maluleke. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for your time. Let me perhaps begin with you, Merita, because you are in studio with me tonight. Every year we have this campaign, and as I was saying earlier, unfortunately, we're not seeing it translate into a change in the violence, a change in the lived experience of the women of this country, or even globally. Why is that?
Indeed, it is that we've been making sure across the world that we observe 16 days against violence. And this year's theme, I want to answer you by linking it to this year's national theme. It speaks to from awareness to accountability. And the reason why we're moving to beyond awareness to accountability is to make sure that we really attain a change. So accountability, not just on the state level, but accountability on civil society level, accountability on the level of our families, of the families of the perpetrators, accountability, unfortunately, that has to be shared with the victim for standing up and to make a case. We want to move beyond a 16 days that is just based on awareness. We want to move to accountability. We want to be able to look back and see that we have made a change.
Dr. Omar, let me bring you in here, because this differentiation between awareness and accountability is an important one. There's no question that South Africa has become good at organizing events around 16 days of activism. We currently excel on those grounds, but it doesn't seem to be doing much for us.
So thank you for raising that question, and just in response to your question is, why are we still where we think, we should not be? If we just look at the years, we are already 30 years down the road talking about 16 days, and then of course commemorating violence against women and children. The approach all this time has been quite fragmented. We've been working in pockets, so not working in a coordinated, organized fashion. But we must realize that there has been a shift. If we go back to 2018, where the President hosted a national summit, listening to the survivors, to the trauma of victims on the ground, I think that was groundbreaking. That was a change maker, certainly, because that catapulted into something bigger, something that we haven't dealt with for many years, regarding a national strategic plan on gender-based violence. And aligned to that was the Emergency Response Action Plan, which looked at multiple, multi-sectoral departments, government departments, holding government departments accountable in terms of their responses, timeless responses, their ability, sensitizing, training, all sorts of resources that needed to be addressed and attached to the respective government department. So we've just begun the journey. I cannot say we're there. We are on a journey, and if we look at resources, previously there weren't resources available to victims and survivors, and if we just look around now, the Command National Center, the National Movement Center, these are 24-hour facilities. Of course, shelters. I'm not saying the shelters are ideal or they have sufficient resources. Specifically during COVID-19, we realized there were many challenges. So I want to say that we have come a long way, but we still need to look at evidence-based information, to look at how best to serve the interests of survivors and victims on the ground, and to hear from them. They need to help us drive this process. So on the strategic plan, we've got not only at a national level, but there's provincial representation and even local level representation, where we want it to be a bottom-up approach, not top-down. So I think, Kathy, that there is a lot of...
All right, and unfortunately,
Okay.
Dr. Omar, we seem to be having a bit of an issue with your connection, but hopefully it will continue to hold up. Advocate Maluleke, let me bring you in here, because even this idea of needing to have a strategy that is aligned across the board, that brings together different role players, one would imagine that it is the department, your department, that is taking the lead in such a process. Are you doing that? Do you feel that you're doing that?
Yes, as a department, we think we're doing that, because for the first time, private sector, labor, your COSATU and others, civil society organizations, government departments, faith-based organizations are working together in order to address gender-based violence. And it's based on the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence.
But even how that plan came about, it was not necessarily born out of government's own initiative, but it was the way in which different pressure groups had come together to say that they will no longer take the slow responses by government to gender-based violence and literally pushed it onto the public agenda. And so even when we look at something like the National Strategic Plan Against Gender-Based Violence, if you look at the report done by the Gender Commission on how effective government has been in implementing some of its own commitments, unfortunately it doesn't look good.
Kathy, I think the way you say it as if it's a wrong thing. Government, civil society, and everyone has a responsibility to end gender-based violence. Gender-based violence doesn't start at the Department of Justice or the criminal justice system. Please give me a minute.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's fine, Advocate Maluleke. We'll come back to you. I'll give you a minute for you to do what you need to do. Merita, let me come to you. This issue of how we even got to a national plan of action is an important one, because again, now that it has moved into the centralized framework, we are beginning to see the stagnation when it comes to how some of these things should be processed, and all of the different departments that are supposed to be contributing a share to this national strategic framework. There's been delays across the board. The commitments that have been made and what has been delivered are night and day. And that is something that we cannot sit by and allow to just be.
I think that's important, and I think it is important to acknowledge that it was civil society that stood up and said, this is enough. We want this to be declared either a pandemic or just something that is acknowledged within our country. And the response of government would then be positive, because government listened. In terms of mainstreaming gender-based violence across all your different departments within our government, it's important. And it's important that we put in place specific indicators that your provincial governments must adhere by. It should not be a commitment that is not reflected in your annual performance plan. It should not be a commitment that is not reflected when different MECs give their budget votes. When we say that this is a second pandemic, and when we say we want to ensure that our women and children are safe, and when we look at the stats of just this past 3 months, then we need to, as a government, respond and say, this is how all our different departments will make sure that our women and children are being taken care of holistically.
Dr. Shaheda, let me bring you in here because, again, these allocations in various departments that are supposed to go to a share of fulfilling the commitments in the National Strategic Plan, they're important because ultimately the inability to meet those commitments means that the situation for survivors of gender-based violence stays the same. The preventative measures that should be in place stay the same. And so as long as the conditions are not changing, then we cannot expect different results.
So, Kathy, you are absolutely correct. I think it's about the implementation. And of course, the implementation requires oversight, monitoring, and evaluation. And if we just look at this most recent debacle of the appointed mayor in Kanaland and the accountability there, where nobody actually bothered to see that he was a convicted child rapist, even his deputy. So what I'm saying is that we cannot paint every department, or even within departments, everybody with the same brush, because we're finding that there's pockets of excellence, but that excellence is not sufficient. It's not adequate, it's not timeless, the responses are not swift and, of course, appropriate to victims of abuse. And certainly with GBV, we are finding that many victims are coming forward. Previously, many of them were intimidated and just sat quietly, and of course, silence is violence. But we are finding that more and more are coming forward, seeking support from civil society organizations. And civil society organizations are certainly trying to drive this, trying to hold the relevant departments accountable for the lack of service delivery, for the untimely responses, or just not, I think, shoddy responses where there's apathy and disinterest because people are not placed in positions that they want to be. If we look at SAPS officials, not all of them want to be in a GBV post. Many of them feel they're out of their depths and overwhelmed, and often their responses speak louder. Their actions certainly speak louder. And these are factors that we need to also look at. When we spoke to Minister Bekicele, we said to him, incentivize these kind of posts so that you choose the best person for the post so that they can deliver. There's energy and there's, of course, responsibility to deliver. And this is where we are lacking, because it's the oversight, the monitoring, the evaluating and selection criteria to ensure that the best people are delivering on the ground to ensure that women and children will remain safe.
Advocate Maluleke, let me come back to you and talk about how, as the Department of Women, and you said earlier that you felt that your department was really at the forefront of ensuring that there's alignment. Which are the departments that are meeting their targets as contained in the National Strategic Plan?
In August, the President launched the first annual report on the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. At that time, we had 10 departments which were, like, every week they were complying with the submission of the reports. There were those that were yellow, amber, that were submitting, and there were those that were red, that were not submitting at all. What happened was, the President is the sponsor of gender-based violence, just like the Deputy President is the sponsor of SANEC, the HIV Council. So every week we were expected to submit reports. So we're supposed to coordinate all government departments in order for them to submit reports. We are not only supposed to coordinate all government departments, we're also supposed to coordinate civil society organizations and the others. However, the challenge currently with civil society organizations is that they do not have an umbrella body. So that's why in the annual report, you do not see the inputs of the civil society organization. But in the annual report, you see the reports of, for example, people like your Dr. Omar. They are part of the collaborative. NSP Implementation Collaborative Initiative. So with them, because they work with a collaborative initiative, multi-stakeholder collaborative, you'll be able to see what they are doing. But also, for the first time, let me not say all governments, many government departments have integrated the NSP in their APPs and in their strategy. And why? Because the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities is invited to their strategic workshop so that we assist them. Also, the gender responsive budgeting and planning. Addressing gender-based violence is not just about the courts, it's also about economic empowerment. That is why the National Strategic Plan has Pillar 5, which says economic power. If you empower women, they will be able to walk away from the violence. Hence, the president pronounced the 40% procurement, public sector procurement, that it should go to women. So also we're working on that. We're working with SALGA, we are working with the DDMs, the municipalities. We've trained the municipalities. Many municipalities have been trained and they've been assisted to integrate the NSP into their APPs. However, as indicated, that some comply, some do not comply. However, now the Parliament, during the 16 days, the NCOP is going to call government departments that are not complying for them to comply.
All right. Let's leave it there for tonight. Let me thank my guests, Merita Ground, Dr. Shaheda Omar, and Advocate Mikateko Maluleke. That's where we'll have to leave it for tonight.